Electrolyte balance. So in this chapter, and in your book it's chapter 26, I believe. 26 or 27. 27 maybe. So fluid and electrolyte, so we're not talking about a system here. This chapter has to do with the importance of maintaining balance. And we've talked basically from when you all were in Biology 103, 201, whatever biology class you take, you hear about homeostasis. So what this is referring to is how important it is to maintain balance within the body and how the body must have mechanisms to maintain the balance. So this chapter really is all about homeostasis. Okay, homeostasis having to do with water balance. So all that means is that within the body, we have to have a certain amount of water throughout in all compartments. Electrolyte balance. What are electrolytes? Any idea? Right. So charged ions, charged particles within the body. So we have, like, name something. Electrolytes: sodium, potassium, right, chloride. So any of those particles that have a charge, a positive or negative charge, or ions, those are electrolytes. And so we have to keep those balanced. We've talked about keeping blood calcium. Calcium is an electrolyte. We talked about how the body keeps calcium in a narrow range, because when calcium levels go too high, something happens. If calcium levels go too low, something happens. So that's the balance that we're talking about here. Okay. So if we look at acid-base, so we'll talk later on about acid-base balance, but that's important too. We said the pH, so here we're talking about pH. The pH of blood has to stay in that narrow range of what? 7.35 to 7.45. So again, here's another mechanism that requires balancing, and there are quite a few activities that take place to control pH. Okay, so that's what we're on to here. Now, so this since the chapter is all about homeostasis, as we say, maintaining balance, what are the other systems involved in making sure that water balance, electrolyte balance, and pH balance are all maintained? Look at the systems that work together to ensure that. Number one is the urinary system, which I'll mention a little bit about later on. But if you think about the urinary system, let's think about that right now. We haven't gone over it yet, but you probably have a decent idea of its job. Yes? It's what? Oh, it must be. I was wondering the same thing. Okay? So the urinary system, what does it do? What would you think? What would you say is probably the important function of the urinary system? What is it doing for the rest of the body, in other words, to ensure optimal function of the body? Get waste out, elimination of waste. Okay, so we talked about eliminating one type of waste with the digestive system, but the urinary system eliminates other types of waste, which we'll talk about. But it also, whenever things get out of balance, if you think back, what happens is most of those involve the kidneys. The kidneys know when to get rid of sodium if there's too much in the blood, when to get rid of potassium. So the kidneys and the urinary system are there to maintain the balance of electrolytes, pH, whenever acids come through. Their job is to get rid of excess whenever there's not enough of an ion the kidneys hold on and doesn't get rid of excess. So I would say the urinary system is probably the main system involved in maintaining balance of water balance, electrolyte, as well as pH. Respiratory system, I want you all to think back. So with the respiratory system, what did we talk about maintaining as far as the respiratory system? Right, so remember CO2, it's exhaled, but what does that do to either water balance, electrolyte balance, or pH balance? Which one? pH? Remember that? So remember, if you hypoventilate, if you're not breathing fast enough, what does that do? Makes the blood acidic. So the respiratory system helps to alleviate that by increasing respirations to blow off the acid. What about the digestive system? So the digestive system and maintaining electrolyte, exactly, absorption of water. So in order to get water into the body, that's the number one area that water comes from, the digestive system. Okay? So, and hopefully you all can go through the other systems and see those as well. Integumentary, just off the top of your head. What do we release from the integumentary? Sweat, which contains water. So that's mostly to help to maintain water balance as well as electrolyte. Endocrine system secretes hormones. Some of those hormones do what? Maintain electrolyte balance, like calcium. Remember PTH and calcitonin. Make sure blood calcium levels are maintained. The nervous system, involved in everything. The cardiovascular system, oxygen, CO2, water movement from one compartment to another. And the lymphatic system. Remember what the lymphatic system does? Fluid balance. How does the lymphatic system balance fluid? What does it actually do? Yes, collects the fluid from the interstitial fluid and returns it back to the bloodstream. Good. All right, so body water. So body water makes up a great percent of our whole body weight. For a newborn baby, their body weight is about 75% water. Young men average between 55 to 60% water by weight, and women slightly less than that. Obese and elderly have a slightly lower body weight by water. And one thing I think we talked about before, that fat is opposite of water. They have an opposite relationship or inverse relationship. So if a person is obese, they have a higher fat content. That means they have a lower water content. So the relationship is inverse. Total body water of a 150-pound male is about 40 liters of water. Now, what I want you all to make sure you get, one of the things to get from this chapter, is the fluid compartment. So where is this water? So in the human body, where do we find this water, and at what percentage? So most of it, what is the body made up of mostly? Cells. Okay, so we're just a big blob of cells. So inside of those cells is water. So you can almost, I mean, if you don't think about it in that respect, it may not be as obvious, but if the whole body is made up of cells, then most of the water must be where? Inside of the cells. Okay, so 65% of the water that we have in our body is inside of our cells. Okay, ICF. Hmm? Mm-hmm. The cytosol. Good. Okay, and then you have the rest called extracellular fluid. So most is inside, the rest of it is outside of the cell. Okay, so 65, 35. Okay, and this further breaks down the compartments that are subcompartments of extracellular fluid. So extracellular fluid is found in tissues. So if you think about a tissue is made up of what? Cells and what else? What is a tissue made up of? Cells and, y'all just looking at me like, what is she talking about? Cells and matrix, right? The material outside of the cell. Okay, y'all somewhere else this morning. Okay, so the other fluid that is outside of the cell, most of that is going to be in the tissues between cells, so to speak. So the space between cells is where we have our interstitial fluid. And the blood plasma, and you don't have to memorize these percents. Just know that most of the extracellular fluid is in interstitial tissue fluid. Then you have blood plasma, so the blood, the liquid of blood, the water in blood, and the water within the lymphatic fluid. And then finally you have the rest of the water, the rest of the body, water contents are in transcellular fluid. It's called transcellular fluid. So transcellular fluid is just water everywhere else in the body, besides the tissue fluid and blood plasma. All right, so when we think about those compartments, fluid continually exchanged between the compartments. So, and you know enough by now to know that the way that water moves from one compartment to another is by what? Osmosis. What is osmosis? Huh? What's the definition of osmosis? What were y'all just saying? High concentration to low? No, that's not osmosis. What is osmosis? Exactly. You have to start the sentence off with the movement of water. You can't just say high concentration to low concentration. A lot of things move. Everything moves from high concentration to low concentration. But when we're talking about osmosis, we're talking about what moving? Water. So water moving from an area where there's a higher concentration of water to where there's a lower concentration of water. So in other words, osmosis is diffusion of water. Diffusion of water. So this happens constantly. So our body is constantly having water diffuse into cells and out of cells. Into the bloodstream, out of the bloodstream. Okay, so fluid is constantly moving. What controls the movement of water from one compartment to the other? That's kind of how you all should be thinking. So osmosis, as we said, water moves from high water concentration to low, but what determines that? The concentration of dissolved substances within water, which we'll get to here. Actually, on this slide, this word osmolarity. So whenever there's an imbalance, the imbalance has to do with there being a difference in the concentration of solutes on either side. Let me show you this picture and then I'll jump back. So looking at this picture, you can see that water moves from various compartments. And kind of let it sink in for a second. Look at the picture and see if it all makes sense to you. So the compartments that water moves between. So how does water get in our body in the first place? There's only one way. To drink it. Yes. Drink it or eat it. So the foods we have that we eat have water content as well. So water comes into the body one way, through the digestive system. So from the digestive system, where does water go? Does it go straight to the kidneys? Right, you all know the path. There is no kidney in the path of the digestive tract. So no water goes to the kidneys from the digestive tract. It has to go where first? Into the bloodstream. Okay? So water is absorbed from the stomach, from the intestines, directly into the bloodstream. So water has nowhere to go but the bloodstream or out through feces. We know feces has water content as well. Okay? So that water comes into the digestive tract, is sent on to the bloodstream. Then what happens? So now water, all this water that we drink, it ends up in the bloodstream, may increase blood volume depending on how fast we drink, but a lot of it, so as it circulates, then it goes through the kidneys. Okay, so certain signals tell the kidneys, well, we need to get rid of some of this water, so there won't be too much water in the bloodstream. Okay, also what happens is some of the water that's in the bloodstream goes into the what? The tissues, the interstitial fluid, interstitial spaces. Okay? Everything making sense so far? So blood. So again, if there's more water than is needed, then the kidneys are going to start getting rid of water. Okay? And that's why if you drink a lot, you run to the restroom a lot, right? To get rid of the excess. So again, the body is trying to keep everything balanced. So we don't want too much water because that affects concentration, but we don't want too little either. All right, so some fluid in the tissues is picked back up by the blood or pushed into blood. So there's different things that cause that. And then what about the fluid outside of the cell? Fluid outside of the cell is called what? Interstitial or extracellular. Very good. So some of the extracellular water can go into the cell. Some of the water in the cell can come out of out into the interstitial fluid. Okay? So what we're talking about here is what determines when water goes here, when water goes here. When water comes inside the cell, when water comes out. Changes in concentration of dissolved substances control that. Okay? How does the lymphatic system work here? So remember what the lymphatic system does? You all just told me. It picks up water from interstitial fluid, right here. So the water here is picked up by the lymphatic system. Does the lymphatic system send water to the tissues? No. All it does is picks up water from the interstitial tissues, and then it sends that water to the bloodstream. Okay? So those are the compartments that water moves between. I want you all to get that mental picture. When water moves, it's moving in one of these directions. And now I want you all to understand what causes water to move. That's the key. And that's where we go back to osmolarity. Remember tonicity, hypertonic, hypotonic. That's why you learned about all that stuff. So if we say that the blood, let's just say in comparing a cell to the ECF. If the ECF is hypertonic, remember what that means? What does it mean to be hypertonic? Excessive what? So what, think about that. What does the term, well, you know isotonic. Let's just start there. So isotonic So if we have a solution that is isotonic, and let's just say we have a cell, and inside the cell, of course, is ICF. Outside is ECF. Okay? So fluid can move between those compartments. Now, if we say that ECF is hypertonic, let's just put it that way, what are we actually saying? So the ECF is hypertonic. Hyper means more, so it's more something than the cell, the inside of the cell. The tonic has to do with concentration of dissolved particles like electrolytes, proteins, so whatever can be found within the water is your tonicity. Okay, so hypertonic means more dissolved stuff, or better, it's better to say a higher concentration of dissolved stuff. Okay, whatever that stuff is, we could say sodium, right? Potassium, proteins, glucose, so whatever. There's more of it dissolved in the water of the ECF than there is dissolved in the water of the ICF. Does that make sense? Y'all get it? So if you say something is hypertonic, you're talking about how much dissolved substances there is there. Usually though, and see that's why I hate for students to memorize, most of the time what you're saying is that a cell, you're placing a cell in a hypertonic environment. Okay, so if you place a cell in a hypertonic environment, something's going to happen. And that's what you all need to understand, what happens and why it happens. Okay, so if we have an isotonic solution, there's an equal amount of dissolved stuff inside the cell and outside of the cell. Y'all with me on that? For isotonic. So if we say that the cell is in an isotonic environment, that means the outside of the cell and inside of the cell have the same concentration of stuff. Okay, but here, if we say hypertonic, the cell is in a hypertonic environment, that means outside of the cell there's a higher concentration of dissolved stuff. So let's just make up a number. Let's just say there's 30% of dissolved stuff, and let's just say the dissolved stuff is sodium. Inside the cell, there's 20%. Okay? That's all we're saying. If we say hypertonic, all we're saying there's a higher concentration of some dissolved stuff outside than there is inside. Okay? Y'all with me? Good. So, what would sodium do? So diffusion is diffusion. It's a law. It's going to happen. So sodium would want to rush into the cell. Whatever the dissolved stuff may be, will want to rush into the cell because there's a what? A lower concentration inside the cell. Exactly. Sodium can't move that easy. Water does the moving. So which way will water move? So water has a higher concentration inside the cell than out. So water is going to move out of the cell by osmosis. Okay, so water will move out of the cell because there's what percent water here? There must be 80% water there and 70% water here. So water is going to move from where there's 80% inside the cell to where there's 70% outside the cell. And it's going to keep moving until those numbers balance. That's just how water moves through the body. Okay? So if you think about blood going from the bloodstream, as in this picture, let's just say you consume some salty French fries and fried chicken. So that salt, again, goes straight into the bloodstream. Nowhere else for it to go. So it gets into the bloodstream. That changes the osmolarity of the blood. Okay? So again, the word osmolarity just means the amount of dissolved stuff. Okay, so if you increase the amount of dissolved stuff, like you do by adding sodium, that's going to increase the osmolarity of blood. So when you see that going forward, all you should be thinking, so we have an increase in osmolarity, what is water going to do? Whenever there's an increase in osmolarity, or there's a hypertonic situation where the dissolved substances increases, water goes to wherever there's a higher salt concentration. Okay? Did you all notice that? So if water is going from high to low, water is going toward a higher salt concentration, right? So that's where the whole water follows salt comes from. Wherever you have more salt, more dissolved stuff, water is going to go in that direction, right? Based on what we said here. So in this case, water would leave the place where there's a lower salt concentration and go to a place where there's a higher salt concentration. Okay?
That increases the blood volume.
Exactly. So very good. So what happens? So you increase salt here in the blood. As we said, water is going to move based on what? Wherever there's a difference in salt concentration or dissolved substance. So you increase salt in one area, water is going to go where? To that area. Okay? So you increase salt concentration in the blood, water rushes from the tissues into the bloodstream, and that increases blood volume, which increases blood pressure. Okay? Y'all remember that? So that's key. So just keep in mind, whenever there's movement of water from one compartment to another, that is driven by the concentration of the substances that are dissolved in water. So if we look back at this statement here, if osmolarity of the tissue fluid rises, think about that. So if we increase the osmolarity of the tissue fluid, what is happening? What are we really increasing? The amount of what? The amount of dissolved substances. So if you increase the amount of dissolved substances anywhere, water is going to go where? To that place where you increase the amount of dissolved substances. So if osmolarity in the tissue fluid rises, water does what? Does it go to the tissues or away from the tissues? Hello? So if you increase the osmolarity of tissue fluid, what we said is that means there's more sodium or more dissolved substances in the tissue. So does water go to the tissue or away from the tissue? To the tissue. So remember, water goes toward where there's high salt concentration. So water moves out of the cell. Okay? So remember the compartments again. So here we're talking about this fluid here. So if the interstitial fluid has an increase in osmolarity, there's more salt, so water is going to come out of the cell and into the tissue. Okay? All right. I think I mentioned everything on that one. Okay, if it falls, so if osmolarity falls, water goes the opposite direction. Okay, so osmosis from one fluid compartment to another is determined by the relative concentrations of solutes in each compartment. You all remember what solutes are, right? So a solution is made up of a solute and solvent, right? What's the solvent? So water is the universal solvent, remember? So in any solution, you have the things being dissolved, and then you have the part that is doing the dissolving. Okay, so one thing dissolves something else. The thing that is being dissolved is called the solute. What is being dissolved in is called the solvent. Okay, so the concentrations of solutes is what determines where water goes. Electrolytes are the most abundant solute particle. Sodium is the predominant electrolyte in the ECF, extracellular fluid, whereas potassium has a higher concentration inside of the cell. All right, so we just mentioned where water comes from. Mainly, water comes from the things we drink. Okay, so everything we drink has water, whether it's juice, milk. Everything that we drink is made up of water. So we gain about 2.5 liters of water per day. 2,500 milliliters is the same as 2.5 liters. So that's how much water comes into the body on a daily basis. And since that's the amount that we bring in, again, to keep it balanced, we have to get rid of that same amount each day.
I wonder about that. Why do they say that there's so many amount, I'm not a glass of water, and the more you drink, the more
Right. So most of, if you drink that much water, it's going in and coming right back out. Yeah. So it is good to get water so you don't dehydrate, but yeah, I never listen to those. Yeah. Okay. And another thing, again, water comes from everything we drink. Sodas, things that people say we shouldn't drink contain water. You don't want all the sugar, so there are some cons to that, but water is in everything that we consume, pretty much eat or drink. Okay, and so gains come from preformed water, which is in ingested foods and drinks. And then we also produce metabolic water. Our cells produce water. In that reaction we've seen, what is this reaction? Aerobic cell respiration. Good. Aerobic cell respiration. And so in this reaction, we start off with C6H12O6. What is that? Glucose. So we start with glucose and glucose and oxygen, and the cell is able to convert that to ATP, recharge the ATP. And it also in the process produces CO2, which we've talked about, but it produces water also. So that is called metabolic water. And we produce about 200 milliliters, and 200 milliliters is about 2/10 of a liter per day. Okay. Water loss. So where does the water go? So the water that we gain, again, has to equal the water that we lose on a daily basis. So most of the water that we lose is lost in urine. The other is in feces, sweat, and then in insensible ways, which are unnoticed, such as expired breath. So when we exhale some water, vapor comes along with that, as well as cutaneous transpiration, which comes from the skin, but it's not from the sweat glands. And this is just a slide showing you the same information there. the importance of water. Body fluid maintenance. Thirst mechanisms maintain volume, blood volume. We'll see how those mechanisms work. Kidney activity regulate volume as well as composition. So the kidneys are in there again, and they're giving signals on whether to make urine more concentrated or less concentrated based on the body's need. Hormones are regulate fluid volume and electrolytes. So we've talked about, again, how these systems help to maintain fluid balance. Sense of thirst, the control center for thirst is in the hypothalamus, regulates total fluid volume, and excessive thirst is called polydipsia. You all remember seeing that? So keep in mind hypothalamus and thirst. But polydipsia is excessive thirst, and polyphagia, remember that one? What is that? Excessive hunger. Okay, so people who are diabetic suffer from both of those, polydipsia and polyphagia. Thirst mainly governs fluid intake. So when you feel thirsty, you get something to drink. Dehydration reduces blood volume and blood pressure. Now, as you all move forward, try hard not to just memorize statements like this. You have to get it, because tests are questioned in such a way to not detect whether you memorize some stuff or whether you understand it and can use the information. So when you see here that dehydration reduces blood volume, think that through, right? Dehydration, water's pulled out of the blood, so blood volume decreases, and it also lowers blood pressure. Whenever blood volume decreases, blood pressure decreases. But it increases blood osmolarity. Help me out on that one. So how would dehydration, and we talked about what osmolarity is. What is osmolarity again? Right. So concentration of dissolved substances. So if you, basically what it's saying, dehydration means pulling water out. So if you pull water out of something, how is that increasing osmolarity? Well, no, nothing's happening but water is being pulled out. So let's just say just water's pulled out, nothing else is happening. So if you pull water out of something, how are you increasing osmolarity? Exactly. So you're not really adding dissolved substances, but you're making the ratio change, right? So let's just say I have this cup of coffee and it's sweet enough. If I pull almost all of the water out, what will the sweetness do? What will happen to the sweetness of it? It'll increase. It'll be sweeter, right? Because you've made it more what? Concentrated. Okay? So if you just pull water out, no sugar, it's going to be sweeter because there's a higher concentration now of sugar than there was before. So same here. If you pull water out of the bloodstream, then the ratio of water to blood changes. Water to dissolved substances changes in such a way that osmolarity increases. There's a higher concentration. You just made blood more concentrated. Okay. So dehydration, osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls this, the blood volume by responding to blood pressure changes. So what happens is when the blood pressure drops, angiotensin II is produced. You all learned about angiotensinogen. So angiotensinogen is going to be produced whenever blood pressure drops. Okay? And also when osmolarity of the ECF drop. And then you have ADH. Remember what ADH does? Water retention, right. So what this is talking about is how the body responds when blood volume drops. So the reason for ADH secretion is to make sure that the body holds on to the water. The kidneys don't get rid of the water, but bring it back into the bloodstream. Okay, let's move on. The only way to control water output significantly is through variation of urine production. So the kidneys are controlling balance by getting rid of excess water if there's enough already in the system, or holding on to it if the amount is dropping. So kidneys can't replace water or electrolytes. All it can do is control how much of each of those is released or held on to. Only slow rate of water and electrolyte loss until water and electrolytes can be ingested. Okay, so the kidneys can't produce those, it can only hold on to them under certain circumstances. So changes in urine volume is linked to the adjustment in sodium reabsorption. So what the kidneys do, kidneys are amazing too. So kidneys are made up of little subunits called nephrons, N-E-P-H-R-O-N, and those nephrons have a way to get a signal and know exactly what to do with excess sodium if there's too much sodium and things like that. How did I get off track? All right. So what happens is the kidneys can hold on to the sodium, which means return it to the bloodstream, or it can send it off to be passed through urine. So whatever decision it makes with that, if sodium is reabsorbed into the bloodstream, water follows it. Whenever the kidneys release sodium through urine, water follows that as well. Okay? Now, so what if ADH is released? So what does ADH tell the kidneys? To retain the water. Okay? ADH release is inhibited when blood volume and pressure are too high or blood osmolarity is too low. So again, keep in mind that antidiuretic hormone is secreted for a reason, and that is to maintain the amount of water that is in the body by decreasing the amount that is released. All right, fluid deficiency, hypovolemia. So know that term. What is hypovolemia? Hypovolemia. Low blood volume. So low blood volume would be expected for an individual who's hemorrhaging, severely burned. How does a person who is burned lose blood? Good. Okay, so volume depletion, water is going to be seeping out of the skin. Chronic vomiting and diarrhea. So all of those result in fluid deficiency, hypovolemia. Dehydration. So with dehydration, again, water is being pulled out. And so with dehydration, would you expect for blood osmolarity to increase or decrease? Dehydration. Good. Very good. So with dehydration, remember you're decreasing the water content of the blood, but that makes blood more what? Concentrated. So that increases the osmolarity. But notice the difference. So both of these, volume depletion, hypovolemia, and dehydration, they're both going to involve fluid deficiency. blood volume is going to decrease. But they're doing it in different ways. So dehydration would result in a change of osmolarity, but hypovolemia would not. So if a person is hemorrhaging, what's happening? Why would if a person is hemorrhaging, why would that not change? Very good. Very good. So if a person is bleeding, they're leaking water as well as those electrolytes and everything else equally. Okay, whereas if you're just pulling out water, then nothing else is coming out but water. Okay, great. Most serious effects of volume depletion: circulatory shock. That means the heart doesn't have enough blood there to force, or enough pressure to force blood through the tissues. Neurological dysfunction due to dehydration of brain cells. So again, where water is lost, it's going to start moving to and fro. So the cells won't have enough water to function. And there was something else there I wanted to mention. Maybe it'll come back up. It had to do with something like this. So is there such a thing as consuming too much water? I think it is going to come up here. Why? What's going on? I remember hearing about a young lady doing a contest. Did y'all hear about that on the radio? They said whoever could drink the most amount of water in a certain amount of time wins a PlayStation 3 or something a few years back. And the young lady won. I think this might have been out in California somewhere. She won, but she died. She died from water intoxication. So yes, you can drink too much water too fast. So what happens is water, again, when you drink it, it goes where? Into the bloodstream. Usually it's the kidney's job to get rid of the water, right? But the kidneys only work so fast. So really the only way that can happen in a normal healthy person is if they're just drinking it jug after jug without stopping. If you spread it out over time, then the kidneys will get rid of the excess water. But that's only if they're functioning the way they're supposed to. So you have all that water going into the blood, then what? So you're increasing blood volume, but what is that doing to osmolarity, blood osmolarity? That decreases osmolarity. I love y'all. Y'all have caught on. And this is the important part to get, what all that means. So if you increase the amount of water in blood, the osmolarity changes. So water is going to leave the blood and go into the tissues. Okay? So then it gets to the tissues, and then what? Goes into the cells. So if this is the brain, think about the brain where this is happening. So water goes into the brain tissue. The brain swells. There's nowhere for water to go. Lymphatic system can't pick it up that fast. So water goes into the brain cells, and they swell. So once the brain cells swell, they may burst, but they can't function with such a low osmolarity. But the main thing is the swelling. So I think she was complaining about being dizzy, they said, and then she just died. And so the brain swelling is not a good thing. So it all goes hand in hand. So electrolytes and their functions, we won't go through the functions, but if you all think back, you may be able to think of some of the functions like sodium and potassium, nervous system, muscle contraction, heart action potential. So all of those organs and systems require sodium, potassium in order for them to function. Calcium, the same thing with muscle contraction, the heart, bone, negative ions, phosphates, and chlorides. So just be familiar with these. I may on the test ask you about the cations. Remember, those are ions that have a positive charge, and the negatively charged ions that predominate are phosphate and chloride. Okay. So you may remember some of these. We talked about aldosterone, ANP. Remember ANP? What is a natriuretic, by the way? I'm sure that'll be on your study hint somewhere. What is a diuretic? What does a diuretic do? Let me ask it that way. Okay, so a diuretic makes you what? Hold on to, get rid of water, right? Okay, so an anti-diuretic helps you hold on to the water. So a diuretic causes the kidneys to get rid of water. A natriuretic causes the kidneys to get rid of something else. What is Na? Sodium. So a natriuretic, such as ANP, you all remember what ANP does? Remember, that's one of the hormones. Atrial natriuretic peptide. So remember, it comes from where? The heart. So the heart cells produce this hormone. So something about blood pressure, remember? So atrial natriuretic peptide lowers blood pressure. Remember that? Okay, so why would the heart make such a chemical? So if your blood pressure is too high, the heart is trying to send a signal that somebody needs to come slow this thing down or decrease the amount of fluid so that the blood pressure can decrease. So what the ANP does is tells the kidneys to get rid of sodium. And by getting rid of sodium, you get rid of what follows sodium, water. So if you get rid of water, what does that do to blood volume? Decreases it. And if you decrease blood volume, you decrease blood pressure. Isn't that amazing? All these little signals. Amazing. All right, acid base. So this is kind of the last thing I want to go over. So make sure you know what acids are and what bases are. Have an idea of the pH scale, where the acids are below or above 7 and the bases. So pH scale measures hydrogen ion concentration. So when we're talking about acid and base, all we're looking at is the relative concentration of hydrogen ions dissolved in that water. So if we say something is an acid, what that means is it has a higher concentration of hydrogen ions. If one chemical is more acidic than another chemical, all that means is it has a higher concentration of hydrogen ions, or will produce. So by definition, anything is called an acid if, when it dissolves in water, it results in an increase in hydrogen ions. Okay, so if I dump hydrochloric acid into pure water, what happens is the hydrogens separate from the chlorides. That's called dissociation. And the hydrogen ions are formed. That's what makes this an acid. So anything that is called an acid is going to be, when it dissolves in water, it's going to release hydrogen ions. That's it. That's all an acid is. So the amount of hydrogen ions released determines how acidic something is. So if it releases more hydrogen ions, it's more acidic. Okay, body fluids have a normal pH of between 7.35 and 7.45. Look at that last bullet point there. That's so important. 0.3 of a point shift in either direction is fatal. So what pH of blood pH would be fatal? 7 point. So 3/10 of a point. 3/10 of a point. If you're going down, let's go down. So you're at 7.35. How low can the blood pH go before it's fatal? 7.05. Right. So a tenth is the 3. So if you drop that down to 0, that's 3/10 of a point shift. So 7.05 could be fatal. And on the other end, if blood pH goes up to what? 7.75, it's fatal. So that explains why the body has to have a set of mechanisms to make sure if it tries to creep up, it's pulled right back down, or if it tries to creep down to too acidic. There are mechanisms to control that. Regulation of pH, buffer systems accept or release ions as needed. So what really is going on when we're talking about pH of blood is the amount of hydrogen ions, concentration of hydrogen ions dissolved in the blood. Now, what the buffers do is if there happens to be too many hydrogen ions in the blood, the buffers, the hydrogen ions can attach to a buffer, and that pulls it out of solution. So as long as you have the hydrogen ions by themselves floating around, they're contributing to acidity. If you take it and connect it to something else, then it's out of solution, so that one hydrogen ion is no longer involved in the pH or concentration of hydrogen ions. So that's what buffers do. We know that buffers, you all learned that buffers what? Resist pH changes. So that's how they do it. They pull excess hydrogens if the pH is too acidic out of solution and attach them to something else. Okay, so a few terms here. You should have an idea of their meaning. Acidosis is when blood pH or tissue pH is less than 7.35. Alkalosis is a pH greater than 7.45. And some of the results are here. So if the pH is less than 7.35, that means it's too acidic, and the nervous system functions a lot slower, more sluggishly. If pH is greater than 7.45, that excites the nervous system. Okay? The origins, so also these are the causes. So the causes of either of those could be changes in blood CO2, respiratory. So remember we said if we're breathing too fast, what is that called? Hyperventilation. So what are we doing to the amount of CO2 in our blood? If we're breathing fast, we're decreasing the amount of CO2 in the blood because we're getting rid of it. Okay? And remember that makes the blood, right, CO2 makes the blood acidic. So if you're getting rid of CO2, the blood is going to be less acidic or more basic. Okay? So that'll cause the pH maybe to shift up slightly towards 7.45 or a little bit higher. Metabolic, so we can have respiratory acidosis or metabolic acidosis. Respiratory alkalosis or metabolic alkalosis. And if you all get into the nursing program, they're going to hit you all hard as crap on this stuff. So know about acidosis and alkalosis. And the differences, so as long as you remember that respiration, if you're breathing fast, you're blowing off CO2, that increases pH. If you're breathing slowly, that's called what? Hypoventilation, what is happening to the CO2 level in your blood if you hypoventilate. You're increasing the amount of CO2, so it's making the blood more acidic. Okay? So that would be considered respiratory acidosis. Okay? Y'all get it? So respiratory acidosis occurs when you hypoventilate. Respiratory alkalosis occurs when you hyperventilate. Y'all get the connection? Good. And then metabolic. So sometimes the acidosis and alkalosis have nothing to do with CO2. It may have to do with the production of acids, overproduction of acids, as occurs with diabetics. So if a person has diabetes mellitus, they're not getting glucose into the cells, so the cells start breaking down fats and produces keto acids as a result. So that would be metabolic, because during the process of metabolizing, trying to produce ATP and breaking down tissues, or breaking down molecules such as lipids, to do that, that will result in the production of acids metabolically. So if you're increasing the amount of acids in the blood that way, that would be considered metabolic acidosis. Metabolic acidosis, because you're still increasing the amount of an acid, but it's keto acids. Keto acidosis, you all heard that before? So you have more acids in the blood that way, decreasing pH. Okay, so when you all get a chance, go back through those. And I think that's basically what I wanted to go over. There's quite a few more slides. I'm going to post these for you all today. As much as possible. I know we kind of ran out of time and won't be able to go over everything. But before you all go to the next level,